The first question for me to ask for this panel is stability for whom? Whose perspective on stability? I have written much about how European Union policies toward the Western Balkans are aimed at its own security, not local security in the Balkans. Vladimir's assessment, Kligerov's assessment already in 1999, when the stabilization process began with the Stability Pact, of the new instrument for these agreements was that they gave clear priority to stability over development, even though we know that local stability is unachievable without economic development, even improvement. The serious political deterioration alongside economic decline in the entire region in the past 5 to 6 years demonstrates fully how counterproductive such a policy has been. Or we can look to Afghanistan and Iraq, where the concept of stabilization that was first developed for the Western Balkans, but institutionalized in US and UK policy for those two countries to see its effects. Even the EU aid policy for Kurds some years ago that was labeled explicitly democratic stabilization was almost entirely for refugee return, that is, leaving European countries and going back. And that aid was primarily only for physical reconstruction. My most recent encounter with this mentality behind this EU approach was just last week when I gave a talk to UN Development Program UNDP staff in Sarajevo about how I explain why the Western Balkans are stuck in what economists call a negative equilibrium, stable but perverse results. The first response to my talk came from a woman working now for UNDP, but whose entire career had been in the Danish Foreign Ministry. But she said, we stopped the war. Isn't that more important? Think of the alternative. And what alternatives do we have now? I did not have the heart to reply that that was almost 20 years ago. Turning to stability in the Western Balkans, the literature in my field suggests two sources to examine. For more than 50 years, at least in American political science, there has been clear consensus that stability of countries, particularly political but not only, has four causes. The first is political legitimacy. I don't mean to say that it doesn't have to keep being renewed, but political legitimacy. Second, a large middle class. Third, at least as measured in the year 2000 when the study for this was done, a per capita GDP, per capita income of $6,000 US. And fourth, institutions, political institutions, that are effective in aggregating and channeling people's expectations and preferences of their government to political elites so that these expectations can be managed peacefully and regularly. Not one of these four conditions exists in any of the countries at issue in this panel, except perhaps the political legitimacy of Kosovo state and of the Serbian state. The middle class has collapsed since the breakup of Yugoslavia. Poverty and unemployment are unimaginably huge in all of the countries there. Not one country has yet returned to the economic indicators of 1991. Elections, and especially political parties, are not playing the role we expect in democracies. The protests in the Bosnian Federation in February and the new efforts at direct democracy, such as the citizens' plenums in Tuzla, but also the willingness of others at the same time to organize violence, burning down government and political party buildings, show the huge frustration of citizens with their political system and their leaders, but even more important, how the institutions of democratic stability do not work for them or to prevent violence and the fear there will be more. The Bosnian case may be the worst at the moment, but it represents a wide situation in terms of conditions and opinion. Finally, fourth, the process of state building is only at the beginning, especially in terms of creating states that have or can obtain legitimacy, as Ivan Krastev mentioned this morning. The last 5 to 6 years in particular, for most people, if you talk to them, average citizens, in fact believe that this process has gone backward, has gone in reverse. The second source of stability in the literature, especially for small buffer states in the international system, which is characteristic about all of these states, is their external economic and security environment. All countries in the world need some regular relations with their external environment, if only so that they can adopt domestic policies, whether public employment or social welfare, for example, to minimize the threat to political stability of the risks coming from the outside, external shocks over which one has no choice and no control, whether economic or security or political. In the book I wrote on why I thought Yugoslavia dissolved, disintegrated, fell apart, Balkan Tragedy, I argued that one of the main causes of the Yugoslav dissolution was the end of an international system, actually beginning around 1985 with Gorbachev's policies, in which Yugoslavia was embedded, had a role, and even which defined much of its domestic political, economic, and security systems. It couldn't continue to exist. It could have evolved, but not as it was. Except for Slovenia and Croatia, this external place for the Western Balkans has not, for all the countries in the Western Balkans, has not yet been defined. Worse, it is highly uncertain, unpredictable, and risky. External actors, whether the European Union, the United States, NATO, the international financial institutions, have played an overweening role in domestic change and politics in all cases since the early 90s, but they have done nothing to anchor them. It's all in the future with conditions that will not be or cannot be met. The clear retreat of the European Union and the United States in the past 6 or 7 years, notice the parallel with what's been happening domestically, has everyone I talked to worried and nervous. The political interference of the international financial institutions, particularly in the case of Macedonia, the IMF, but also the World Bank, just days before an election, makes people furious about its taking sides and shifting the electoral results over which they then don't have any control. The Ukraine crisis has made them all unbearably nervous because they realize that there's nothing to protect them and anchor them. One can easily say, as the European Union, the US, and NATO do, that this is a local problem. Their leaders are not meeting the conditions of membership, so what can they do? But that's hypocritical at best. If the stability of the Western Balkans is in the interest of Europe, and I said as I began my talks, I believe it is, then it should be that it is their main focus and priority, then they will and should at least find a way to address this problem effectively. Retreat shouldn't be an option. I do not believe the current apparent stability can last because both sources, external and domestic, that I've discussed, are deeply entwined with each other. Just notice how archaic, in terms of the European Union, the following statement by Chris Patton, still then an EU commissioner, at the Thessaloniki summit in 2002, now sounds, and I quote, only 12 years ago, "Our choice is clear. We would either export stability to the Balkans or would import instability in Europe." Nobody thinks that way anymore. Perhaps the question to end on is, given our focus on enlargement, what role do we expect Croatia to play? I say that not only because I'm great respect for Žarko Puhovski, a Croat, And with genuine hope, and not in the sense that Lilia Shevtsova said this morning, that is to say, delayed disappointments, it's a wonderful term, but also to underline how worrisome the vacuum of some appropriate policy for the Western Balkans now is. Thank you.